Okay, let's go. Okay, everybody, let's get started. We have our remote guests with us in the auditorium, and time to get rolling. So I am Cam Carey, a distinguished visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and I'll be moderating this panel. I'm sorry that we don't have Congresswoman Cathy McMorris Rodgers today. I was looking forward to introducing her. I'm a Democrat, an ardent one, but have a lot of respect for the work that she and other bipartisan members of Congress have done to move the American Data Privacy and Protection Act forward. And I certainly look forward to hearing her discuss the paths forward today. But we will certainly have the ADPPA as a backdrop to this discussion. Our topic is synergies in global data frameworks, and that topic today really reflects the extent to which data flows, privacy, data governance, and the digital economy have really become central parts of the global discussion. 10 years ago, when I was the general counsel at the U.S. Commerce Department, I was to a significant extent as the number two or number three person at the agency for most of the time that I was there, the senior U.S. government official dealing with these issues with overseas partners. Today we have presidents and prime ministers dealing with those issues, as we saw with President Biden going to meet with the EU President von der Leyen. And in the midst of dealing with a war in Europe, they were also dealing with issues of data flows. And those issues have been major parts of G7 agendas, G20 agendas for the last several years. And of course, we had President Biden and von der Leyen announcing a new data flows framework. And we see a number of other multilateral forums. We'll discuss some of those today. Some are ad hoc. We've seen the Christchurch Declaration on platform content. We've seen earlier this year the Declaration on the Future of the Internet from an ad hoc coalition of countries. So we're going to look at how some of these issues are rolling out. We'll do it in three segments. We're going to begin with our government representatives, and each will give a brief sort of introductory statement, and we'll have a little bit of discussion among them. And then hear from our representatives from the private sector, and then move into a discussion among everybody, including questions from the audience. So we'll start with Ralph Sauer. The EU, as everybody is very aware, has been an extremely active player in the digital arena, and particularly when it comes to data flows. It's now 2 years since the Court of Justice invalidated the Privacy Shield framework, 6 months since that Biden-von der Leyen meeting. Ralph has been very much in the middle of this as the Deputy Director of the European Commission's, the DG Justice, Data Flows and Protection Group. And really has, over the past 5 years and more, become an expert in American law. In fact, I, a few weeks ago, made a stupid mistake about the American Data Privacy and Protection Act on Twitter, and Ralph very matter-of-factly corrected me. Ralph, it has been, as I mentioned, 6 months since that announcement. I think it's obviously top of mind for a lot of people here. It's not the only thing that's happening at the European Commission when it comes to data flows. But what can you tell us about the status of that framework, and what else are you working on in relation to data flows?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much to you, Cam, but also to the organizers for having me. And it's already worthwhile joining because I've just been promoted to deputy director, so that's already great. I'm the deputy head of unit of indeed the department that works on international data flows and protection, so the international aspects of data protection. On the successor to the Privacy Shield, and I understand that this is on top of everybody's mind. I'm a bit, when I say this up front, I'm a bit limited still in what I can say. We work under confidentiality, and that's a very good thing. To have a trusted environment to discuss these things. So not all of what I can say will perhaps be new, but I go as far as I can, let's say. So indeed, since the announcement on the 25th of March on the agreement in principle, we have worked very hard together with our US partners to finalize the details of the agreement. As you said, it was an agreement in principle, so certain details still need to be worked out, and in particular translated into legal text. And I think that is also known that this will in particular include a new executive order to be adopted by the US president on the aspect of government access. And I should also stress that the focus of these negotiations has always been on government access, namely the limitations and safeguards with respect to government access and effective individual redress. Those were the areas that the European Court of Justice looked at with respect to the old Privacy Shield decision, and that's what we have been working on. These talks have been very constructive, I think I can say, and I can also say that we have significantly advanced in our work. And I would also like to use the occasion to commend our colleagues from the US administration. And these talks involved a number of different departments and agencies for their openness to discuss these delicate issues. National security is certainly not an area that is sort of an easy topic to discuss in a cross-border context, certainly. So I really wanted to commend them for the way they have approached this and which has made it possible to have these very constructive talks. So we're very advanced in this, and I think that brings us very close to being able to propose a draft adequacy decision. I say close because there's also a need to update a bit the rest of the framework. As I said, we are not negotiating other aspects of the framework than government access, but the Privacy Shield decision was adopted in 2016, so 6 years ago. And of course, there have been some developments. To give you a very simple example and an obvious one, the framework still refers to the former Data Protection Directive and provisions of that directive that applied in the EU at the time, but which has in the meantime been replaced by the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. That's just one example, and there are similar examples of that kind. So that's not about renegotiating the commercial aspects in particular, but to update the framework in the light of simply what has happened. And then obviously we have to prepare a draft adequacy decision. And of course, we are not waiting for that until the very last moment. We have, of course, already tried to work on this in parallel as much as we could on the assumption that we come to a successful outcome of the negotiations. So we then, once everything is in place, can finalize that work and then start the adoption process. Many of you will know by now or have heard what that involves. It requires an opinion on the draft decision from the European Data Protection Board. That's the body that brings together all national data protection authorities in the EU. And then the green light from the EU member states in a particular committee. And also the European Parliament has a right of scrutiny with respect to such draft decisions. So that's all part of the process. And once this procedure is completed, the Commission will be able to adopt the final adequacy decision. When exactly that will be the case is also not easy to predict, or at least to predict with an exact date or even week. Also because as I said, the process is not entirely in the Commission's hands. There are other institutional stakeholders that are involved. But based on our experience, and we have said this before, we might be looking hopefully at sometime in the beginning, in the spring of 2023. So that's, I think, what I can say. Apologies if I cannot go into further details. Beyond the successor to the Privacy Shield, and I will keep that part short, just a couple of thoughts from the perspective of my work on the topics of this session, creating synergies with global data protection regimes. The first thought that crossed at least my mind when seeing the reference to global data protection regimes, which do not really yet exist, except perhaps for what is called Convention 108, the only global international agreement on data protection. But what crossed my mind, or what came to my mind, is convergence. Convergence between national data protection regimes and regional convergence, of which we see a lot. And it's my belief, it's the belief of my institution, that this is the best way to facilitate cross-border data flows and trade, and also the best way to enable cross-border cooperation. So to reduce the differences between data protection regimes and make sure that we all sort of endorse the same core principles, rights, and obligations. And this idea of convergence is increasingly also reflected in G7 and G20 statements as a central element and a foundation to facilitate interoperability of legal regimes. And so we're following with great interest the developments on the American Data and Privacy Protection Act. Indeed, as Cam has already mentioned, while we are very interested in this draft, in this bill, which seems to, in my view, considerably contribute to convergence between the EU and the United States. What I flagged in my tweet was basically it would be, of course, important that the safeguards in this act are also available to all personal data, including personal data of foreigners. Data of foreigners that has been collected or transferred from outside the US and is then processed in the US. And unfortunately, in the current bill, that's not the case, but I am hopeful that maybe that's something which could still be addressed. I also wanted to very briefly mention the Indo-Pacific Declaration on Privacy and Data Protection, something which has maybe gone a bit unnoticed. That's a declaration that was signed on by the EU, but also by a number of our important partners: Australia, India, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Singapore. And in the meantime, also the Philippines and Taiwan have signaled their agreement. And it's a very interesting declaration. I think it stresses the importance of data free flow with trust. And it sets out a number of core principles and safeguards that we all share and believe are part of this trust. Lastly, it refers to enforcement cooperation between supervisors as an important element, which is also something that I very much share. And those are my last two thoughts. There is the OECD work on developing global principles for government access. We have Audrey with us, so I'm not going to say anything further about this, but it's also an important element of exactly that work. And it's also in a way about convergence. It's about expressing commonalities among OECD member countries. And lastly, the model contract clauses. Those are model data protection contracts, which I believe are increasingly an important tool for interoperability between different countries and data protection regimes, because they ensure data protection safeguards at contractual level. And it's not just the EU that has endorsed them as one of the core instruments for data transfers, but also the Ibero-American Data Protection Network, and ASEAN, and also countries like the UK and New Zealand. So it's an increasing number of national and regional players that work with this tool, and the Council of Europe is also developing such standards. So that's something which would be interesting to further dig into this later on, but I'm already way beyond my time, so I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. So Ralph mentioned data free flows with trust. Shannon Koh, you are the International Trade Administration. Your title is Director of Global Data Policy, touches on a lot of those issues. I should add that, with a note of pride, that Shannon went to ITA from the Office of General Counsel. But earlier this year, the U.S. announced a cross-border privacy rules forum. And cross-border privacy rules are something that was part of the APEC framework, something that I experienced when I was at the Department of Commerce, that ITA was very much pushing. Tell us a little bit, about that forum, why that in place of the APEC framework, and where you see that going, and how does that fit into the broader data free flows with trust discussion?
Well, thank you, Cam, for the kind introduction. It's certainly a pleasure to still be working with my former boss. I have noticed a trend that once folks start working in this space, they tend to stay here. And so the pleasure on my part is continuing to work with people even once they leave the government or change positions. It's certainly an exciting time to be talking about these issues. So appreciate being here this morning, and I particularly appreciate the title of this panel, which is talking about synergies. And synergies are based on cooperation, and cooperation is at the center of U.S. policy on these issues. So I'm really happy to be here today to talk about one of our key international strategies for promoting cooperation here, and that is the cross-border privacy rules, which I will from now on refer to as CBPRs. So the United States has long been a participant in and a supporter of the CBPRs. which is a multilateral data privacy certification program. And I thought I could start off just to talk about sort of why this is a key part of our strategy and what are some of the key benefits to this model to establishing synergies. First is that the program itself helps to establish a common baseline of data protections across all participating jurisdictions. And this is key for a lot of reasons, including that it facilitates understanding of the rules in different jurisdictions. It identifies those commonalities, so we know this means the same thing in all these different jurisdictions, and they're all enforceable. Another key benefit of this model is that it facilitates cross-border enforcement. For a government to join this system, it has to first identify an enforcement authority that can enforce the commitments under the certification against any organization that's certified. And then further, that enforcement authority agrees to cooperate with the other enforcement authorities across border. So again, further enhancing trust among the appropriate authorities. Yet another benefit that we see here is that it establishes a mechanism for mutual recognition. So all of the participating governments in this system agree to recognize certifications that are issued in their own, or in all the other jurisdictions. So certification issued in the United States is recognized in the 8 other participating economies and vice versa. So I think what we see here, there's both, you're getting the advantages of allowing organizations to stay local and for it to be accessible and understandable, but also have a global reach with their privacy programs. Yet another benefit to this model is that it enhances consumer protection. So one of the requirements for organizations to participate in this program is that they have a consumer redress mechanism. So in addition to a backstop enforcement authority, consumers have an access to independent redress mechanisms, so further giving them further options for ensuring that their rights are properly being protected. And then finally, just to make the point that as we talk about synergies and cooperation, we see a need for flexibility. There are a lot of commonalities, and I really appreciate Ralph's point on that, and I emphasize similar things, or will certainly happily do so when we delve deeper into the discussion. There are a lot of commonalities in our approaches across, data protection laws around the world, and those stem from, all the way back to the OECD framework, the APEC framework, and so there's a lot of common principles there. But there are still differences. There are differences not only in the laws themselves, but the legal frameworks in which they're implemented. So there is a need to acknowledge, to both build on commonalities, but acknowledge and respect that differences will remain. So how the CBPRs addresses this or promotes this is by the participating members agree on the outcomes, the privacy outcomes we want, and then there's flexibility in how you arrive at them. So this allows for connecting, jurisdictions as different, from the United States to Korea, Japan, Singapore, et cetera. And I think that's going to be increasingly important as we now look to expand the CBPR system beyond the Asia-Pacific region. So just a couple of quick points on that, because, Cam mentioned the establishment of the Global Forum. So this CBPR system was developed within APEC, so it's currently limited to participation to the 21 APEC members in the Asia-Pacific. So by establishing the Global Forum, we are now seeking to globalize the system and so allow broader membership that's not limited to APEC membership. So that's our primary intent. Happy to talk further if folks have questions, but maybe just to end on the point of sort of how does this fit into the bigger picture? Again, happy to follow Ralph and appreciate that the acknowledgement that there are lots of different mechanisms and tools that are being considered. And I think from our perspective, we don't see that there's a one-size-fits-all. So for the United States, it's really important that we continue to support and promote having numerous tools in the toolbox. So this certainly is one that we see a lot of promise for being globally scalable, not only for governments, for regulators, but also companies. But there are, lots of tools, and I think from our perspective, in the here and now, we need to continue to look at all those tools and make sure that we have access to as many as are valuable and useful. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Shannon. Let me turn now to Audrey Plunk. Audrey, your organization, the OECD, is, by its name, involved in economic cooperation. And your title in the Science, Technology, and Innovation Directorate is Director of Economic or Digital Economic Policy. And yet, for the last 2 years, the OECD has been dealing with the government access discussions that Ralph mentioned. It's something that, on its face, is outside the ordinary remit of the OECD, outside the competence of a lot of the OECD ministers among member states. Can you talk about sort of the state of those discussions and how that fits into the broader work on digital free flows with trust, which the OECD is where the OECD is helping to support G7 work and other work?
Thanks, Cam. It's great to be here. Sorry to not be in Washington, as lovely as it would be to be in person. Sure, I'm happy to talk about the OECD's work on government access. I guess I'll just take the bait, since you baited me on the role of the OECD and its mandate. And I guess I would say that while it's true that the traditional communities that come to the OECD don't tend to be national security and law enforcement entities, that's not exclusively true. We have cryptography guidelines, at least in my division, that we're responsible for, that date back to the late 90s, where many law enforcement agencies came to the OECD to write guidelines around how to responsibly and in a law enforcement responsible way use cryptography and in a privacy protecting way. So the OECD has a long history, and while we are focused on economic and social progress, it's not at the exclusion of security topics. So just on with regard to the work that we've done the last 2 years with our member countries on government access, this really stems from the OECD's long history in privacy and data protection. Probably everybody here is familiar with the privacy guidelines, and one of the things notable about the privacy guidelines is that they're really focused on the data protection and privacy laws, and they're not focused on legal frameworks around national security and law enforcement access to data. In fact, they explicitly note that exceptions to data protection and privacy laws apply in the realm of national security and law enforcement. And so as the world has evolved, both since 1980, when the privacy guidelines were originally adopted, and they were very forward-leaning at the time, and the last time they were revised in 2013, obviously the world has changed a lot. And so the focus, as Ralph said, on the European Court with regard to certain aspects of individual redress in the U.S. system and other topics around government access to data, prompted our countries to ask us to look at this issue. At the time, a couple years ago, when it was brought to the table, it was also in the context of the data free flow with trust discussions happening in the G20 and the G7. And if you fast forward, I think, to where we are today, we've assembled a very unique set of stakeholders from our membership, namely those from national security authorities, law enforcement authorities, and privacy authorities across OECD countries. A very broad participation. The OECD is comprised of 38 member countries, and we've had about 25 actively participating in the development of principles for the better part of the last 2 years. I think the thing that's important to know about OECD processes and instruments is that they're non-binding, they're not legally binding, and so one advantage to that is that it allows a little bit of space for discussions that might be harder to have in stricter kind of negotiations. Which is not to say this topic has been particularly easy, as Ralph can also attest. But I think we've found a few really important things, and I'll just mention them, and then I know we're sort of low on time. But the first is that we found a lot of commonalities, and people have mentioned already commonalities. But in our actual deep work with the experts and in our research to support this work, we have found a lot of commonalities. Now, legal frameworks differ, particularly in national security and law enforcement. Countries are on very different timetables and when they update their laws, and it's a very different beast in some ways. But we have still found, despite those differences, we found that the democracies that are comprised at the OECD have many, many commonalities in how they safeguard personal data when law enforcement and national security access those data. And so we've been able to articulate much of those commonalities in the context of sort of principles that are both high level but also fairly specific in a lot of ways, in order to hopefully build trust in how the systems across the OECD how they treat personal data and the safeguards that they apply in the context specific to national security and law enforcement. This has required discussions about different kinds of legal frameworks than are only discussed in the data protection community. So it's not about necessarily general data protection laws, but it's more about comparing national security and surveillance laws, which of course raises sensitivity. So I'm pleased that because we've mostly focused on, of course, public laws, we've been able to overcome and get past some of those sensitivities and get to what I hope will be what we call an instrument at the OECD, which is a recommendation or a declaration, or what we call a legal instrument that's non-legally binding, that really articulates what is common across OECD countries in their safeguards for personal data in law enforcement and national security context. And so that will be that we think that's a new thing for the international community. We hope it can, assuming that we get there, and we're hoping to be able to finalize it by the end of this year, that it will provide at least a baseline or a common language that will help as we start to, as we continue to rather advance this notion of data free flow with trust, intertwine our economies together. And I guess I'll just finish coming back to where Cam started, which is that we do see a very strong economic imperative here. We're all using the same infrastructure, that the issues are no longer siloed between, this is privacy and this is national security. These things all converge and they have real economic impacts. And I think that's where the OECD has been called in to try to help move the discussion along. And so we're really pleased with the progress. I want to thank many colleagues who I'm sure are here, and Ralph himself for his excellent support to the process as we hopefully move into the final stages and have something that we can provide at the end of the year. So thanks.
Thanks, Audrey. I'm going to pass over the crosstalk among the government panelists just in the interest of time, and so we can be sure to hear from our private sector representatives. And that this really, I think, broadens the economic lens of the discussion. So I think where Audrey left off is I think a great segue to that discussion. Evangelos Razos, you're now at Workday, but you were at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in an international role before that. Now you are very focused on the ADPPA. Talk about, what you see as the global implications of that bill. How does it affect this global discussion and global synergies that we've been talking about?
Happy to, and it's a privilege to be able to join in person and talk about these critical issues. First, a little bit about Workday. We are a enterprise service provider, enterprise software service provider, and really focus on human capital management and financial management spaces. Thank you. Broadly, I just want to associate myself with something that Audrey said, which is data flows is an economic imperative, and that's certainly the case. It's hard to do international trade or operate across different markets without being able to transfer data across international boundaries, but also to do so with trust, with privacy protections. To answer your question, though, Cam, about the ADPPA, I think it's apt to talk about that in this panel around global synergies. What we see, and we can draw a line from the OECD privacy guidelines to GDPR to state-level privacy laws, especially Virginia, Colorado, Utah, Connecticut, and the ADPPA, is this distinction between controllers and processors. This is an important distinction especially for those of us in the enterprise cloud space, a distinction between companies, when companies determine the means and processing of data and often have a direct relationship with consumers, and companies that process data at the direction of other companies. Workday is very much a processor. We provide our enterprise software to some of the most sophisticated organizations in the world. They own their data. They control how it's used. We provide services in a manner that supports them. And it's important that the ADPPA recognizes this, and it's a sort of underreported element of convergence. This distinction has important privacy implications, making sure that these roles are crafted in a certain way that, again, it reflects the obligations reflect the role the company plays. So happy to talk a little bit more about that, but I understand we want to get into question and answer a little bit.
Thanks. So let me go to you, Matt. You've also got a trade background. You also formerly worked at ITA and have done trade work at Microsoft, but now it's global privacy policy. So talk about how you see those integrating, and maybe a little bit, is there some role for trade discussions, trade agreements in privacy and in data flows?
Thank you so much, Cam, and thank you to Forum Global for having me. It's a real honor to be here. I want to step back just a moment from trade and kind of ask a question: is why are we all here? I mean, I think for all of us, we have a sense that data is important. Yes, it's important for business. Yes, it's important for government. But I don't know about you, but for me, it was important for every aspect of my family's life, especially over the last 2.5 years, just in our house, for going to the doctor, for my kids going to school, for going to religious services, to the arts and culture. We watched concerts together from our couch, things that if COVID had been 10 years earlier, we might not have been able to do it all. So when I think about the stakes of what we're here to talk about, I think it's brought home in the last 2 years. Maybe it's more important than any of us realized when we entered this space and this profession. And when we think about the moment we're in, I think you can have pessimism or you can have optimism. On the pessimistic side, I think we've all heard the phrase balkanization of the internet, fragmentation of the internet. It's a worrying time to think that this magical tool that's allowed us to continue living the lives we value is at risk. And yet at the same time, what I've been moved by today, here are some of the words I've heard on the panel this morning: commonalities, understanding, trust, synergy. Synergies right there in the name of our panel. It gives me reason to hope. And that's what really made me excited to talk on this panel, is the work that is happening at the OECD, at the CVPR, and even in trade talks. You asked about trade talks like the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, gives hope I think that countries that share value, that people that share fundamental commitments to privacy, to data protection, to human rights, to democratic values, can converge and find ways to keep protecting those values and also allowing data to enrich our lives. So I guess what I want to say is I'm really excited to see trade agreements, but also OECD agreements, agreements on government access, agreements on privacy converging to give us hope there's a way to keep this global internet working.
Thanks. I guess before I ask any questions, does anybody, particularly our earlier speakers who didn't hear everybody speak, want to respond to anything that anyone has said? Ralph, how about you?
Sorry, I muted myself. I think I'm not going to say much on what Audrey has said because I at the beginning already make clear how important I find this work. So there I fully share what she has said, and I think lining up with what was just said before, I think that's indeed a very important part of the puzzle. If we even in such a sensitive area can come together to express commonalities, then I think maybe not all is lost, and indeed there is a way if one tries hard enough to indeed find common ground and get past certain perceived differences that maybe are sometimes overstressed. On certification and CBPR, I think our view on APIC CBPR is probably known. I mean, we of course open and interested to see what will global CBPR look like. Will it be different? Will it be further developed from APIC CBPR? I don't know whether Shannon will be able to say anything on that. I think we had in the past some queries and concerns perhaps about let's say the clarity and stringency of some of the substantive standards, the enforceability, individual rights, and maybe to some extent also the actual enforcement, because at least I'm not aware of any enforcement action in the past on APIC CBPR. So I mean, all of this I think would be important to create that trust. Certification as such is certainly something which we fully support. We have that as a transfer tool in our EU data protection regime as well, but it has I mean, there are high standards to certify, and one requirement, which is even in the law itself, is that they have to be enforceable individual rights. So those are important elements, I think, to look at. Aside from that, I think, and that's why I referred to model contract clauses. I see a certain difference there. I believe that there is always, and that will be the same for an EU certification system. There is always an issue, I think, that this is more made, in my view at least, for larger companies, less so for small and medium-sized companies. That's simply because certifications take time. They are labor-intensive. If you do them correctly, if you have a sort of a certification system which really looks at things, and they might also be costly. And all of that, I think, is a bit reflected in what we see in the past. And when it comes to global certification systems, they usually haven't attracted too many companies. And that's why we believe, I mean, absolutely these things can go in parallel, and probably they should. But we think that model contract clauses are more geared towards the whole market, and in particular also small and medium-sized companies, which at least in Europe are the backbone of the economy, because they are pre-approved. You don't have to negotiate them. You cannot negotiate them actually, but you also don't need to go through a certification process, because what you do is basically you commit at contractual level to certain things. So that's to certain safeguards. So that's maybe just one reaction I wanted to share. Thank you.
Evangelos.
If we can maybe take a step back, because I know, many of these issues can get very technical very quickly, and there can be a sort of discussion of how can we get to sort of the perfect, not that I'm saying Ralph is doing that, he's certainly not, but how do we get to sort of the perfect system or the perfect transfer mechanism? And by taking a step back, I think it's important to recognize that governments are grappling with these issues, many of which are complicated, as folks in the audience have probably picked up. And how do we both promote data flows, which are economic imperative? How do we address legitimate public policy concerns like privacy? And how can we do that in a way that is less trade restrictive, or without sort of getting, being able to appropriately balance these policies. So as a result, we need as many sort of options as possible. And I think from the company standpoint, we are members of the CBPR and the PRPs and welcome the global privacy, the global CBPR forum. At the same time, we also are members of the EU Cloud Code of Conduct and use SCCs, and we're also Privacy Shield certified. And so I think from the company standpoint, there's an element of pragmatism, I think, and also a recognition that the depth of the problem or the scale of the problem requires much more government cooperation, which I think we've welcomed from all three speakers, which is interoperability just doesn't happen. You need this very sort of slow but plodding diplomatic work that sort of chips away at the issue, and be it at the OECD, be it bilaterally through a new privacy shield, be it multilaterally through the CBPRs or at the OECD. I think there's we need more diplomacy, not less, more tools, not less.
Go ahead, yeah.
I will be quick. I mean, there's a lot of points there that I can respond to, but maybe just to follow on what Evangelos said. I think the key here that's revealing, at least from my experience in working in this space, is that data flows, data innovation, and data protection are not zero-sum propositions. In fact, I think we would view them as mutually reinforcing. What I find very interesting is it seems like we are all agreeing that we share the same values, that data flows are essential. We need connectivity to drive innovation, but we also, at the same time, need data privacy, data protection, the trust aspect of it. And so it's really important to, coming back to commonalities as a word that keeps getting thrown around. I'd say the challenges here are, starting first with if you want to say the bad news, is that these are quickly evolving issues. And this type of cooperation or coordination, especially among governments, can take time. And some issues are complicated. Some issues are farther along in those discussions, and some, like Audrey was talking about on the OECD Trusted Government Access, are new and unprecedented, and we're really just in many ways starting these discussions, certainly in a multilateral form. The good news is, though, all of this work that we've been doing for decades, to be clear, that we have identified a lot of commonalities, and we built the relationships and brought the right folks into the discussions that also weren't necessarily thought of to be involved. These, law enforcement, national security, trade, all of these things are implicated here. So I do think, to leave on an optimistic note, we have a strong foundation to build on, but there is, of course, more work to be done.
There's some threads here I want to pull on, but does anybody else want to jump in before I do that?
Only thing I would add, and I think, Shannon, you may have alluded to this, and is maybe a key part of the solution is to recognize things seem to get most heated when they become zero-sum. And it feels like I have to trade my system versus yours, and that if it's not exactly like mine, that my fundamental interests are at stake. And it seems like stepping back and saying, where are these commonalities where we can move forward together is really the key. And it feels like there's a bit more of that happening than maybe we saw in previous years.
Great.
So I'll share the note of optimism.
Great. Yeah, so I want to ask about where all this leads, but I want to interject a comment on what Audrey said about the integration of the economic and the law enforcement discussion, because when I went into the Commerce Department in 2009, I really had no idea that I would become as involved in issues of law enforcement and intelligence collection as I did. But, that was often an uphill battle. And, we saw in some of the Snowden response some things that really took things backwards and eroded trust. Clearly, I think those lessons have been learned, I think particularly in the United States, which has had to adopt a kind of radical transparency on these practices. I think others are learning, but I think what we're seeing in those discussions is I think another cause for optimism. I want to sort of explore a little bit how all of these things fit together. And maybe they don't. Evangelos, you sort of talked about layering all of the frameworks on top of each other. I think Microsoft does that a little bit too. But there are, I think there are differences in objectives here. You talked about interoperability, Evangelos. That's a term that's used in the G7 communications, in the cross-border privacy rules forum announcement. Ralph, you talked about convergence, and I think that may be something different. So, let me ask you all to, and maybe Ralph, you could start. I think you may have hinted at some of this in your follow-up remarks, but sort of briefly, how you see those as different, and let me throw that out to others as well.
I mean, first of all, I think on interoperability, at least, I'm sometimes not entirely sure what is meant. I have to admit. I think what it could mean is the lowest common denominator. That would be one interpretation, and that would certainly not be one that I would find very inspiring and a good basis to have data free flows with trust. But it could mean that because if I don't know, if systems are different, if the ones with lower protections don't want to scale up and endorse the protections that others have, then somehow you meet at the lowest level that everybody is comfortable with. That would be one possibility. I'm not saying that this is what those that support interoperability have in mind. I guess you can also have something which is sort of in the middle, an average of what different regimes have in terms of protections, and so you meet there in the middle through instruments that are sort of outside your system, but to which you or companies at least nevertheless commit, and that means that companies that come from legal regimes that have lower privacy protections would have to at least at a contractual level or at a certification level go beyond that. I mean that's also a possibility. I think what is clear is for me at least, what is convergence? Convergence means that, and it's a goal, it's an objective. I'm not saying that we are there, but it's something that we believe is worth working towards, namely to reduce the differences in the legal regimes, the data protection regimes that exist. We are not naive in thinking that all of these differences will go away in one go. And we're also not naive in thinking that that means that every detail has to be the same. But convergence around sort of core principles, obligations, rights, institutional structures, such, I don't know, for instance, having an independent authority, supervisory authority. Those are things where we see a lot of convergence, and we simply think that this is the best basis to have trust and therefore to facilitate data flows. Where this is not yet the case, as I said, we endorse instruments that are more sort of on the interoperability side. I mentioned model clauses, certification has been mentioned, and again, it's also something that we have as an instrument. So I think they are not exclusive, and I think you see that in the G7 and G20 statements of late. They refer to both, and I think they, if I remember well, also say that convergence is sort of the best or one important foundation for interoperability. So I think there is a link. And since Audrey is there, I mean, the OECD has done a very good job with this going digital toolkit on interoperability of data protection and privacy systems to set out sort of a bit the landscape of different instruments that are used to increase interoperability, and some of them are clearly systems, I think, of convergence, like adequacy findings. At least the way we understand them are about recognizing that another country has a very similar data protection regime, and that allows the free flow of data. So that's, but they are also part of this list of interoperability tools. So you can see that there's a clear link between the two. I think one are maybe some instruments are maybe a bit more demanding than others.
So Audrey, Ralph alluded to the OECD doing work on interoperability. So tell us, from your standpoint, what does that term mean?
So I'll just say that the privacy guidelines talk about interoperability and support it. So what the privacy guidelines say is encouragement and support of the development of international arrangements that promote interoperability among privacy frameworks. So this concept of interoperability, I think, dates back for a long time. But I think, as Ralph has underscored, people have different associations with what could be meant by that, and it's been difficult to define. We did publish a paper, the one that Ralph mentioned, on interoperability of privacy frameworks, sort of trying to take what is in the privacy guidelines and put a little more meat behind it. I will say, I think, so there is a attempted definition. It sort of says it could be considered these things, but I think what at least we mean in the OECD context is that these systems work together, that not that we're going to the lowest common denominator, but interoperability in the sort of more of the technical sense, and that because we're sort of the wonky technical part of the OECD that thinks about internet infrastructure and measures broadband and does all these, we do lots of things over here. In my part of STI. And so I think we think of interoperability as like very functionally, how does this system talk to that system, whether the system is technical or the system is a law or a policy. But I think a lot of, as others have said, I think a lot of work needs to be done to sort of maybe take away some of the baggage that comes with some of these terms that have developed over the years, and maybe find plainer ways to talk about them. Just something that we've attempted to start doing. It's not a perfect fit. There's more work to be done. On the topic of convergence, and this is a real live conversation that happens daily with our members at the OECD. I think there is somebody on the panel said there's sort of a little bit of concern that there's from some countries that we have to adopt, exactly the system of another country. And so really what we're trying to do at the OECD is help translate between those systems in a way. It's what we've done with the government access principles. And as boring as definitions can be, the OECD has a long history of helping people come to definitions. Our definition of AI is being used very broadly around the world, including in the context of the Council of Europe negotiations on a treaty on AI, including the Commission's discussions on the AI Act. So this is an area where we think we need to put more attention in the future to sort of helping provide a better understanding. I'm happy to provide a link to the paper. It's very short. And again, just want to say that I think what we all have in mind is finding ways, tools, as Ralph said, to have our systems work together. And I think that's at least the spirit in which the privacy guidelines talk about interoperability.
Okay, Evangelist, quick comment, and then I want to take an opportunity for floor questions.
I'm just going to bring this back to a very American perspective around privacy, which is commercial and national security. When it comes to the commercial side, I guess the question is, and bringing back to something Matthew had said, what are we doing here? We want to ensure that companies are empowered and have the tools to do the right thing, which is to handle data responsibly, to do that in a privacy protective way, and to be able to transfer data across international boundaries and do business abroad. On the national security side, that's certainly something that individual companies can't do as much. Certainly, we can't, and that requires a government-to-government agreement around national security practices like what's being discussed at the OECD. And I just wanted to bring that sort of down to that level, because that's certainly how the view is from an individual firm. Rather than sort of these questions around convergence versus interoperability, it comes down to how do we promote privacy in terms of commercial practices, and how can we support governments, especially like-minded governments and allies like the EU and the US, to be able to work out these thorny issues and signal our support for them to hash this out. So just that was the comment I wanted to make sure we got on the record.
Questions from the floor? So another former Commerce Department.
Jim Sullivan with
veteran.
DLA Piper. You all hear me okay? Evangelist, I think you did a great job sort of encapsulating with cross-border data flows. What we're basically talking about, the areas of concern are what businesses do when they collect personal data and use personal data, and then government access to personal data. We now have, on the commercial side, a global certification mechanism. In the OECD, we've got a great initiative underway to develop some high-level principles on government access, and there's phenomenal precedent there. And we had, excuse me, in the 1970s, we passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In the subsequent years and decades, other countries adopted the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. That looks like it's off to a great trajectory. I'm trying to understand why CBPRs, for example, pardon me, as a global certification mechanism is not more urgent. Like, is the EU actually at the table? There's precedent there as well with Privacy Shield, with Safe Harbor. I'm just curious, and I'd love to hear more about whether there's active discussion on that.
Who wants to take that one?
I guess I
Shannon?
can. Sure. So I guess I might start with disagreeing with another former boss, Jim, who asked the question with the proposition that it isn't urgent, CBPRs. Because I think what we're seeing now, and that's what propelled our globalization of the system, is that it is in fact urgent. Going back to when this system was established and it was endorsed in 2011, the system itself was has sort of been described as a solution in search of a problem. These issues were not as prominent and urgent as they are now. Since then, we have seen a proliferation of laws. Nearly every jurisdiction, if not every jurisdiction, has laws and requirements that apply to how personal data is processed. I think also you've seen increasing demands from consumers, from business partners to have their people who are collecting data be able to demonstrate strong privacy practices. So, in fact, I do think the need is urgent, and that's why we're moving forward and prioritizing this in this space. It is important to recognize, however, that, and this sort of gets back to different tools that we've been talking about, tools in the toolbox for addressing these issues. Each of the tools has its own shortcomings, its own benefits and its own shortcomings. On the CBPR side, CBPRs only deals with commercial protections. So to the extent we're talking about what the OECD is doing, that's a separate matter and dealing with different issues. at some point, as these issues continue to merge together and are of commercial importance, we'll have to look at that. How do these things work together? But I will say, looking at the other tools as well, also, you have to think about sort of how do we build on the best of what they have to offer while sort of acknowledging that there isn't a one-size-fits-all, whether it's standard contracts. And I think what we're going to see there, while there is some definitely some advantages to having pre-approved terms, the proliferation of different contract structures we are already hearing is making this an increasingly complex area. Contracts are having multiple addendums depending on where they're sending their data. So, perhaps there's a need to figure out interoperability among standard contracts, for example. So I think there's a lot of work yet to be done, but to end on an optimistic note, again, I do think what we've done in Privacy Shield, bridging between the US and Europe in a very innovative way, that acknowledges that we're different, but we share values. We can build on that. We have been, at the table with European authorities discussing interoperability between binding corporate rules and CVPRs. We can, continue to build on those commonalities. But as I said, lots of work to be done, but some great foundation to build from.
Great. Well, I think we're running up on time, so I want to, put a lightning round question to the panel to answer in 1 minute or less. We're solving the global problems in an hour here. So in 1 minute, give me your vision of where these frameworks lead. And I'm going to start with you, Matt, because you mentioned the prospect of balkanization. Are we, with these sort of different frameworks, different aggregations of countries, going to a fragmented, or at least bifurcated world? So, Matt, you're first. Then I'll go to Audrey, Evangelos, Ralph, Shannon.
So I think I'm an optimist at heart, but I think it would be hard to, there are some serious differences in the world that are hard to see going away in how certain societies and governments view the appropriate way to treat data. Where I'm optimistic is there's a big enough group who share a commitment to certain values about the fundamental right to privacy, fundamental rights around democratic values, that these societies can overcome their differences, that the urgency is there, that it's not that far over the horizon, that we have a lot more interoperability than we've had even in the recent past, and kind of more assurance and trust around the flows, at least among that part of the world.
Audrey?
Thanks. I guess I'll say that I think all of these things have to continue. There's never going to be one framework or one solution. Like these different approaches exist. They cover different regions. The OECD doesn't have a court behind it to enforce its recommendations, yet they have been very influential in developing, anti-bribery laws was an example given earlier, or privacy laws. So I think there's a lot of space, and we'll, hopefully the things that are coming out are going to work together. And I guess one thing I failed to stress is that, one of the big underlying themes here is that democracies do things in a particular way. They're not exactly the same all the time, but they tend to have, some key pillars that are common across those democracies. And so those need to use the converge word, come together and work together in a way. And they are binding rules, and there's room for corporate governance, and there's room for ethical norms and other things that work together in that space to get us to a greater enhanced understanding of how these systems work, because you may say interoperability and I may say convergence, but maybe we really might mean more or less the same thing at the end, hopefully. So thanks for having us.
Thanks. Evangelos.
I wish I could say affirmatively I was either an optimist or a pessimist, but it really depends on the day and maybe the time of the day. So I will say the future is still being written, and it is very much contingent. On the one hand, we have very positive news to see a U.S. president and commission president at a political level affirmatively say, after very hard work by Shannon and her colleagues and Ralph and his colleagues, we are going to have an agreement around transatlantic data flows. On the other hand, even when we make progress, there are times where, even within Europe, there are some concerns around data localization. And I will point to the EU cloud cybersecurity framework and the concerns around that. And so the future is still being written. I think at the end of the day, it is going to take, there is no silver bullet, and it will take a lot of creativity and a lot of sort of persistent diplomacy and cooperation. But I think the saving grace is that we agree on a lot more than when we disagree. And so perhaps that's an optimistic note, but it is just before lunchtime. So I am perhaps a little bit more optimistic as a result.
Thank you. Ralph?
Well, I'm now, I think I was thinking back, I think 6-7 years doing this kind of stuff. But surprisingly, I'm still an optimist. So it doesn't seem to have affected me too much. I'm very, as I said, very interested. We are very interested in the ADPPA. As I said, that could be a great basis for further convergence. Maybe it could even be a basis for an adequacy finding at some point that goes beyond the Privacy Shield framework. So that's one thing I mean, which requires, however, that it applies to all personal data and not just to the personal data of U.S. residents. But that I think is one cause for optimism that I see, and I think that would also make a lot of the rest of the discussion much easier, including, and that's my only second point. I think ideally, indeed, we would at some point have a global certification system, a global MCC, so global model contract clauses, both, and both including the US and the EU. I think that would be the ideal solution, and of course many others, those that are like-minded. And then probably it would not be maybe so good for privacy conferences, because then there would be nothing to talk about any longer. But that's something that I certainly think is not impossible and that we should work for.
Good. Well, Shannon, no home court advantage. Commerce Department gets the last word.
Well, and not to keep everyone from lunch, so definitely we'll keep it short. I like what everyone's saying about mixed views, optimist and pessimist. I think that's right, but I'm also an optimist like Ralph, and I think from where I sit, the work that we've put in recent years with our European colleagues, with our colleagues in the Asia Pacific region and beyond, we have a really great place to have these discussions. If it weren't for the work that has come before, the relationships that we've established, the identification of the different issues and the authorities that are appropriate to speak to them and bring them all together and realizing we're all under the same umbrella, we would be in a much worse position than we are now, starting from scratch. But fortunately, I think that alone gives me reason for optimism, and I will leave it at that.
Great. Well, I want to thank my fellow optimists on the panel for joining us today, and for their contributions over a long period of time. And now it's time for lunch. Thank you.